Friday, December the 1st, the year 2000. This is Sylvia Kirschman, sitting in the family room of Doris Cohen Edelstein. Doris is a war bride of Canada. She lives at 85 Range Road, apartment 807 in Ottawa. She's prepared a beautiful paper on her history, and I'm going to allow Doris to read it for the tape.
My name is Doris Pauline Streamer, later Cohen, and still later Edelstein, and I was born on March the 11th, 1925, in London, England. My memories of childhood are mostly happy ones until the sudden death of my mother when I was 11. My father, Daniel Streamer, was born in London in 1890 and had, as we say in England, the gift of the gab. He was a born salesman. He and his partner owned a bespoke tailor shop, specializing in made-to-measure gentlemen's suits. Daddy was smart, feisty, quick-tempered, and adored my mother. He was an amateur boxer in his youth, a bantamweight, and followed the Arsenal Football Club all his life, as does my brother. He should have been a barrister. In his later years, he would spend many hours at the Old Bailey. Sitting in on cases, he became a regular there. Lawyers and judges would nod in his direction, thinking that he was one of them. They often asked his advice, much to his delight, and he didn't hesitate to give it. As a young man, he went to New York to make his fortune, leaving behind in London his fiancée, Rachel Bernstein, who would become my mother. After 3 years in New York, he had done extremely well, and he came home to pitch his bride, who refused to budge. She wouldn't leave her very large family, so he sent to America for his trunks and married my mother in May of 1924. They settled in a Victorian house, which was still modern in those days, in North London, where I was born the following year. My mother, Rachel Streamer, or Ray to her family, was beautiful, elegant, and much taller than my father. She was a modern woman who played the piano and kept both a kosher home and a lovely English garden. She would change the lyrics of popular songs to make them funny and had a wicked sense of humor. As an only child, I would walk down the street with her and heads would turn, and I was so proud. As a family, we often went to the West End of London for concerts and theatre, or to the Palladium for wonderful musicals. I remember seeing the movie Showboat and The Jazz Singer in the late 20s, early 30s, and my mother playing Paul Robeson's Old Man River and Gracie Fields on the gramophone. In 1933, my only brother Dennis was born. I was almost 9. No sibling rivalry to report, only a relationship of great closeness and love that has endured for 67 years. Then, in 1937, when Dennis was 3 and I was 11, our happy life was shattered. Our mother died of pneumonia after nursing all of us through the flu. There were no antibiotics in those days. Our lives changed forever. My father, thinking that he was doing the best for us, and not able to live in the home he had enjoyed with my mother, sold our house and moved us closer to his business, halfway across London. Overnight, we lost all that was familiar: our mother, our school, our neighborhood, our friends. I was sent to a different private school in the middle of term. The curriculum was different too. They had started algebra and geometry 5 months earlier, and I hadn't. I managed to get 14% in math that year, although I don't know why. Household help was hard to get. They were always strangers, sometimes alcoholics. So I learned to open cans and gradually how to cook. That was in 1937. It is important to remember the political climate in England in the 30s. Hitler had come to power in Germany, and anti-Semitism was on the rise in England too. So Oswald Mosley and his brown shirts were on the march. Fascist views were spreading with public demonstrations, bloody riots, and articles in all the papers. A year before she died, my mother had written a letter to the editor protesting anti-Semitism, and it was published in the Times. I still recall her last line: Referring to Anglo Jewry's role in World War I, she said, "We were Britishers then, why not now?" So, suddenly, the atmosphere in our school had changed, and I was the only Jewish student. I was sent to Coventry. Do you know what that term means? It means that nobody was permitted to talk to me. I was shunned by my classmates. A new student named Gloria, whose brothers were fascist brown shirts, decreed that I was a pariah. This went on for 2 or 3 weeks, and I can't remember whether I told my father or any of my teachers. But then a young Irish friend named Leonard Kelly called Gloria's bluff. Leonard started to send me notes, to speak to me openly, and gradually things returned to normal. But rumblings of a new war in Europe had begun, and would soon become reality. Hitler had already seized part of Europe, and on September 1st, 1939, German troops marched into Poland. On that same day, September the 1st, thousands of British schoolchildren were making their way to their schoolyards. Each of us had a small suitcase, a label with our names over the school uniforms, and a gas mask. I was 14, and Dennis was 5. We knew that this would happen and had practiced using our gas masks, but when evacuation day finally came, tears were spilling over everyone. It was difficult for our father, now alone, to see Dennis and I leaving, not knowing where we were going or when he would see us again. Dennis and I climbed aboard the train. As we traveled farther away from London and past other large industrial cities, the trains began to slow down and stop at smaller towns. At each town, a group of children would leave the train. At Kettering, in Northamptonshire, it was our turn, and my next memory of that day is standing in the middle of a large street while the people who had volunteered to take us in as evacuees looked us up and down, saying, "I'll have this one, and I'll have that one." Eventually, Dennis and I found ourselves in a small house with what seemed to me like a very elderly couple. That didn't last long, and we were moved to a larger house with a larger family. I remember Mr. Cross, the head of the household, making wonderful Yorkshire pudding with roast beef for Sunday dinner, a small miracle since rationing had already begun. Mr. Cross had been injured in the First World War, and as a result his left leg was rigid. When he sat down, his knee did not bend, and his leg stuck out in front of him, and I was terrified of walking into it or tripping over it, and I think I did a few times. Our school in Kettering was a very modern one. As the regular classes filled up with the newcomers, there remained groups of children, so small classes were put together with the leftovers. The ages ranged from 6 to 14. Dennis was in kindergarten, and it was fun. We had a marvelous male teacher, and the older students, like myself, would often help with the younger ones, much like in an old-fashioned Canadian one-room schoolhouse. It was very different from anything else we knew. Compared to most, Dennis and I were well treated and happy. I made a new friend, Rhoda, and we remain in contact to this day. Other evacuees were not as lucky. I remember a little girl of about 8 or 9 who began to sit on our doorstep every morning around 7, waiting for Den and I. As soon as we would come out, she would jump up and hold my hand, and we would all walk together to school. She was always poorly dressed and freezing cold, not particularly clean. She saw that I was taking care of my brother, and I think that she felt safer. I mentioned her to Mrs. Cross, and a few days later the little girl was gone, to a nicer home, I'd hoped. Her story was not unusual. Some of the evacuees never returned home. Their parents were either killed in the bombing, or they just never bothered to come and claim their children. While the latter was not common, it did happen. I want to stress that there were many good times, too. We were teenagers, after all. We wanted to have fun, and we did. My friends and I started a social club we named the 40 Club, because 40 members was all we could handle. We plastered Kettering with posters, rented an attic, and danced. We charged a small admission fee to buy records, and I can still remember the first one we bought, Glenn Miller's In the Mood, still my favorite. Two of the young men in the club were 17 and volunteered for the service. One was later killed aboard the huge battleship Hood on its maiden voyage, sunk by the Bismarck. Early in 1942, at 16, I returned to London. Dennis remained in the countryside, safe and well cared for. I got a job as a secretary in the West End. London was still being bombed regularly, as was the rest of England. Skies were ablaze with fire. Some nights the air raid warnings never stopped. Too old for active service, my father had volunteered as an air raid warden, so that several nights a week he was on duty and I would be alone in the apartment. He always made me promise to go right into the air raid shelter if the siren went off, and I always intended to do so. But the young have no fear, and I would cover my head with pillows and hope for the best. One night, during a particularly heavy bombing, there was a direct hit on the building next to ours, and the window and frame of my bedroom blew out and shattered all over my bed, showering me with glass. I waited nervously for my father to return from duty to take me to hospital, to have glass shard removed from my eye. Luckily, he was more relieved than angry. But London was still London, busy and alive with theatres, restaurants, bustling crowds, humour and courage in equal measure. The war lent a sense of urgency to everything, and a sense of excitement. And speaking of excitement, I met my future husband, Philip Cohen, in January 1943. I was 17. A colleague of mine who had joined the RAF would visit our office every few weeks. On Jewish holidays or weekend leaves, he would invite a couple of Jewish servicemen home. One of the regulars, Maury Cransgrove from Ottawa, mentioned to me that a friend had just received his commission as a pilot officer and would arrive in England any day. He suggested the three of us get together. At 17, a Canadian Air Force officer seemed very glamorous indeed, and I said yes. We arranged to meet at Covent Garden. We had a lovely evening together, and Philip asked if he could see me again. I gave him my address, and within a few days he wrote, and I replied, immediately. We arranged to meet at Tottenham Court Road, outside the Dominion Theatre. It became our meeting place. So began our lives together. Philip came to London and stayed at the Canadian Officers Club every other weekend. We wrote each other every day, from January 1943 until my arrival in Canada in March 1946. I have a suitcase with hundreds of letters, both his and mine. Perhaps one day one of our children will write a book. Philip Cohen was born in Montreal in 1916 and came to Ottawa at the age of 1. The adored youngest son in a family of 7 children, his parents had emigrated from Romania in the first decade of the century. His father, David Cohen, a baker in the old country, became a fruit peddler. He died when Philip was a teenager. His mother, Bryna Cohen, née Fisher, when he was in his early 20s. Philip's oldest brother had managed to go to Queen's University, and Philip, a medalist at Lisca, took correspondence courses from Queen's while beginning his career in the civil service during the 1930s. He placed in the top 3 among the thousands who wrote the civil service entrance exams, a feat that was oddly duplicated by Nat Edelstein, who would become my second husband, 8 years after Philip's untimely death at 54 from a sudden heart attack. My children claim that their mother is only attracted to brainy Ottawa boys with Romanian roots. The two families have been close friends in both the old country and the new. Phil completed his university degree 7 years after the war ended, at night school, again winning medals. He had interrupted his studies when he volunteered for active service early in the war, and like so many Canadians, joined the Air Force. He did his basic training in Trenton. Later, of the hundreds in his radar course, he was among a handful who received their officers' wings. We have a wonderful Karsh photograph of Philip as a newly minted officer in his uniform, hat, and gloves. It was actually taken by Karsh's assistant, a Jewish refugee from Europe named Pollock, who was using the studio to take his own photos while the great man was out. Apparently there are dozens of these beautiful Karsh portraits from that era all over town. Phil's family gave him a stainless steel Rolex watch to celebrate his commission, and he sailed for England. Others will have told you about those dangerous voyages, the huge convoys of ships frequently attacked by German U-boats, even in the St. Lawrence River. Philip was quiet, gentle, modest, and loved to love. Deeply religious, he read extensively on Jewish philosophy and history. A gifted amateur violinist, he started a music appreciation course for his fellow airmen, which gave him an excuse to play. I remember a date where we set off from London and went all the way to Bournemouth by train, just to hear the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, Philip's favorite. In England, Phil was stationed at Foreness near Margate on the southeast coast, and later at Paddington in Yorkshire, where he was in charge of radar, then top secret. Philip got on famously with my father and brother. He soon became one of the family. His friends, Maury Kranzberg and Nat Leverton, from Ottawa, were also regulars in our home, sharing Jewish holidays when they could, and visiting on weekend leaves. Somehow my father always managed to know someone who was able to provide something extra for the boys. Bottles of scotch would appear, a couple of chickens, a turkey, boxes of chocolates. My father would bring home these bundles, and we would look in wonder at the feasts he managed to acquire without, or so we assumed, any ration coupons. Food and clothing were tightly rationed in England during the war. An extra egg was a treat, so my father's bundles were especially welcome. They were, after all, for the boys, so who could question? On March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1943, Philip proposed. We had known each other for only 6 weeks. I had just turned 18, and I felt it was too soon. I was too young to make such an important decision, and there were all kinds of problems to overcome. How could I leave my family? Who would look after my brother? The bombing of London and other areas continued day and night. Suddenly, we realized a new danger had arisen, unlike anything we had ever seen. The V-1s, or buzz bombs as they were nicknamed, began falling all over England, London especially. There would be a loud sound, it would stop, and within seconds there would be a huge explosion and enormous damage. The V-2s were even worse, because they were bigger, faster, and gave no warning, so there was no chance to escape. One day I got an excited phone call from my father. A V-2 had fallen in front of his shop and had not exploded. The whole area was evacuated and cordoned off, and the size of the bomb and the depth of the hole that it created were incredible. During this time, Phil was traveling all over England. Later he told me that as a radar officer, he was part of the response team fighting against the V-2s. With radar, it was possible to track them, shoot them down, or explode them at high altitude before they could reach their targets. As I said earlier, Phil had become very close to my family, and as the year 1943 reached its end, we were determined to become engaged. In late December 1943, we announced our engagement. My father was not pleased. As much as he loved and approved of Phil, whom he already thought of as a son, the possibility of my leaving England was not one he relished. In addition, it was customary in 1943 to ask one's parents' permission to marry, and we had not done so. So Philip very formally asked for my hand in marriage. My father, realizing that we loved each other and that he loved us, gave his permission. His only request was that we wait a year before we marry. A compromise was reached, and we set the date for September 1944. Philip's family had been kept abreast of their brother's English romance, and welcoming letters and telegrams began arriving non-stop. I already felt secure as a new member of the Cohen family, but the thought of leaving my family and home was a continuing concern. Philip understood this. He wrote on December 8, 1943 that, quote, "While my desire is to take you back to Canada, since in Canada I would feel more secure as to our future, I could never leave England without you." My main concern was my brother, Dennis, then 11. However, in the meantime, a relationship was blossoming between my father and a dear family friend, Dolly. They were married 3 months after Phil and I. The fact that she had always adored my brother did a lot to ease my mind. She was a wonderful mother to him and is still alive and well at the age of 96. Heavy bombing continued throughout 1944. As soon as the siren sounded, I would grab my wedding dress, which Dolly had created, and head for the bomb shelter. I had learned. Phil and I were married on September the 4th, 1944. Rabbi Jacob Eisen, a Canadian Air Force chaplain, flew in from Ireland for the occasion with a portable chuppah. The civil ceremony was at Caxton Hall. Both the religious ceremony and reception took place at the Rembrandt Hotel, with about 35 guests. We honeymooned in Wales, then on to Margate, where Philip had managed to find a lovely little bungalow for us, surrounded by lavender. The war ended in May of 1945. We celebrated with champagne, and I kept the empty bottle as a souvenir. By October, Philip was on the Queen Elizabeth heading home. Time moved slowly without him. I got a job in my friend Rhoda's family shop. Fried's made ballet shoes for dancers all over the world. But somehow, I could never cotton on to how to measure the ballerina's feet. Luckily, there was a 6-month waiting period for delivery. I was safely out of the country before scores of ill-fitting pointe shoes could arrive and cripple the poor dancers who awaited them. Finally, I received my embarkation papers and was to leave for Canada on March 14, 1946. I was ecstatic, but as the day grew nearer, the realization that I was actually leaving my family and my country began to dawn. This was it. My excitement began to wane. Another close friend, Anita, was on the same ship. As we waved goodbye to our families and boarded the Aquitania, we made a pact. We decided, in all fairness, that we and our husbands would stay in Canada for 6 months, and if we didn't like it, we would all return home to England. It was only fair, we said. It didn't happen. The Aquitania was packed with war brides and their children. My friend Anita and I were lucky enough to have a cabin with a few other girls. Many women had to sleep on the rolling ship's floor, as had a lot of servicemen returning home 6 months earlier. Our first glimpse of Canada was of Halifax, not the Halifax of today, but a rather drab-looking town where we bought oranges and peaches, our first in months, and quickly boarded our train. That train trip from Halifax to Montreal in March was tinged with sadness for many of the war brides. None of us could believe the huge stretches of barren landscape that went on and on and on. Every little while the train would halt. The conductor would approach one of the war brides and guide her to the exit, sometimes with no station in sight. We'd watch as a horse and buggy would appear in the distance. As it grew closer to the train, one could see a group of people waving. Used to big cities or lovely English countryside, the young war bride, often with a babe in arms, would hesitate, not knowing whether to get off or not. I can still see them putting a foot down on the train step and taking it back, putting it down, taking it back, wondering whether this could possibly be where their Canadian husbands actually expected them to live. And I've often wondered what happened to them. We changed trains in Montreal and boarded a smaller train for Ottawa. A handful of war brides exited the train. We were all nervous and excited. Suddenly, Philip was beside me, and then all of his brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews. My father had had made for me a matching navy blue Barathea suit and coat for my grand arrival. I had managed to find a matching navy hat with a feather in it and a pink silk blouse, not easy to come by in war-torn England in 1946. Immediately we were showered with confetti and a big party awaited us, the first of many. Phil's brothers and sisters are no longer with us, but their children and grandchildren are still a big part of my family, as are those of my second husband, Nat. Philip presented me with 2 gifts, which I still treasure: a sterling brush, comb and mirror set, and silver candlesticks, all from Henry Burke's. The warmth I received from Phil's family and friends was easy to reciprocate. It wasn't hard to love them, too. They were fine people, just like their brother, and I always understood that getting along with one's spouse's family was paramount. Luckily, it wasn't difficult. We settled in a small 1-bedroom apartment on Stewart Street, owned by Phil's brother Abe, who had saved it for us. Apartments were very hard to come by, and we considered ourselves very lucky. We lived there with our 2 firstborn children until 1952, when we moved into a slightly larger house, also in Sandy Hill. Later we moved to Qualicum, and now here I am, back in Sandy Hill. I had made up my mind that this was my home, this was my country. I decided not to join a war brides organization, as many did. I joined the National Council of Jewish Women instead. I preferred to get to know the Canadians I had come to live among. I made up my mind to integrate. It took me 16 years and 4 children to finally revisit my family, only to realize that Canada was home, despite my love of England. In 1946, I saw what a different perspective Ottawans had of the war. While in England, weeks would go by without eggs, once 15 weeks. Rationing would continue for years after the war. Food on this side of the ocean was in abundance. My first meal in a restaurant was a T-bone steak, big enough for a family of 5. It took some getting used to. Since those days, Ottawa has prospered and grown into a beautiful and worthy capital. While we were not yet blessed with a National Arts Centre, we saw many great artists like Misha Elman and Yasha Heifetz on the stage of the old Capitol Movie Theatre. We accumulated new friends, and these friendships have endured. A night out in the 40s and 50s would be a whole gang of us going to the Gatineau Club to see Ella Fitzgerald, Tony Bennett, or Jack Carter. One of our friends knew the manager who would let us in free. We would bring our own bags of potato chips, drop them on the table, and buy a beer or a rye and ginger ale. If we were particularly flush, we would then go on to Imbro's for a 75-cent spaghetti supper. After the war, Philip had returned to the civil service, where he became an economist. One of the highlights of his career was representing Canada at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, where he organized the first international conference on automation and technological change. We and our 4 children lived in Switzerland in 1963-64, where they attended the international school. Geneva was a marvelous and broadening experience for all of us. From Geneva, Phil and I would often go over the border into France for lunch. There were so many charming restaurants to try. One day, we were stopped by 2 fierce-looking gendarmes for speeding. When one of the French police discovered we were Canadian, he smiled broadly and practically saluted us. It seemed that he had been with the Free French during the war and stationed in Canada, Halifax, I think. While we were used to this from the Dutch, it was delightfully surprising in France, and certainly better than a speeding ticket. But back in the fall of 1946, I received both wonderful and terrible news. The good news was that I was pregnant with my first child. The more worrisome news was that I was also in the early stages of tuberculosis, possibly a legacy of the war. The TB abated during the pregnancy, but returned after the birth of my daughter Ruth. I was put to bed for many months, and both mother and new baby were monitored and tended by private nurses at home. Rest was the only treatment at that time. There was also no Medicare, in those days, so Phil worked at a second and then a third job to pay for the nursing care. He showered both mother and baby with loving attention and concern. I recovered, and together we went on to build a wonderful life in Ottawa. Phil died in 1971 when our youngest child, David, was 10. In 1979, I married Nat Edelstein, who was introduced to me by my lawyer, his best friend. At that dinner party, I recalled that I had once met someone in London during the war named Edelstein, but his name was not Nat. Phil and I had just become engaged, and we were crossing Oxford Street. As we stopped on a traffic island halfway across, Phil called out to a handsome Canadian Army officer passing the other way. "I want to introduce you to my fiancé," he said. We all chatted briefly, the lights changed, and we went our separate ways. I told Nat this story, and he asked me whether the Army officer's name was Herzl. I replied yes, and added that the name had stuck in my memory because it was so unusual. Nat quietly laughed and said, "That was me." Nat is my first name. My second name is Herzl, and that was what people called me when I was growing up in Ottawa. Thus, for a few moments in 1944, I had stood on a traffic island in the middle of London with both my future husbands. So, in a curious way, that makes me a war bride twice.